Hi everyone. Today we're going to be reviewing the book, The First Frontier, The Forgotten History of Struggle, Savagery, and Endurance in Early America by Scott Weidensaul. Here's a quote, a review of The First Frontier. Creating a new civilization is a bloody, destructive, and morally withering business. For proof, one need look no further than frontier American life. In this comprehensive chronicle, Weidensaul sheds light on the shadowy world of pre-revolutionary America. Weidensaul weaves together an impressive number of true stories, bolstered by first and second-hand records and journals. Any reader who picks it up will get a very real picture of what it was like to live and die in the New World. So, who is Scott Weidensaul? He's an ornithologist and writer. So, he's not the typical author that I end up reviewing books for. I typically end up reading books primarily by historians, but this one was very well reviewed. And so I wanted to give it a shot. He primarily ends up researching about birds and migrations and is a field researcher. Has published more than 30 works. So he's primarily known more in the ornithology realm. However, The First Frontier was a excellent, dense but excellent read. So in the main arguments, it attempts to cover 250 years of American history, really looking at the relationships between American Indians and the various colonial powers. So not just the English colonization, but also looking at relationships with the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French. He acknowledges from the beginning that there is a incredibly lopsided and imbalanced historical record, that the more literate societies left significantly more records, and those records are not always unbiased. So he takes on a massive undertaking to uncover a lot of the oral history that has been passed on through the generations regarding this history. He really shifts back and forth between big, broad narratives and personal stories. Um, as the as the title suggests, The Forgotten History of Struggle, Savagery, and Endurance in Early America, it definitely addresses the violence that was happening on the frontier. And what he does is he really turns the story of the First Frontier into a story of people, complex individuals and societies who sought to make sense of this new kind of world. You can uncover the terrain of that lost world where Europeans and Native Americans were creating a new society and a new landscape along the tidewater and among the forests and mountains, one by turns peaceful and violent, linked by trade, intermarriage, religion, suspicion, disease, mutual dependence, and acts of both unimaginable barbarism and extraordinary tolerance and charity. So, really, it isn't just about violence on the frontier. It includes all of those things. It talks about the mutually beneficial relationships that took place. It talks about the trade. It talks about the intermarriages. All of that is included in The First Frontier. So let's break down the three main sections of the book. So part one is going to really cover how North America became first inhabited by humans, and it discusses both old theories and new research. So this is really a historiography section. So it's going to address the more widely understood history, or the more widely taught history of the Beringia theory, that way back in the ice ages we had people from Siberia come over to the United States, or present day United States, North America at the time. And it contends that there are new theories, and it really dives into the research behind those new theories. So it was very interesting from a historical perspective, from a historiography perspective as well. Then when we get into part two, this is where we are going to see more of the relationships develop between American Indians and Europeans. So it examines the colonial explosion of the 17th century, the earliest tensions, as well as initial peaceful and cooperative interactions. And so in this section, Weidensaul kind of takes the history by region. And so we see initial focus on maybe like the New England region, and then the Chesapeake, and then the southern areas. And what that does is it helps you to understand that although tribes were different, there were regional similarities between American Indians. Additionally, the Europeans who came and settled in those areas also had different interests and different um, behaviors. And so it's very difficult to take this complex history and make it digestible, but by separating into more regional history, it helps you to understand some of the trends that took place. And then the last section is really going to focus on the backcountry, so kind of on the area near the Appalachian Mountains, and it discusses the relationships and conflicts that resulted from multiple European countries who all sought wealth and land ownership. And so we get into some of the larger conflicts like the Seven Years' War, the French and Indian War. But in this section, it really dives into the various rivalries and alliances that developed as a result of having multiple European nations in the country, in the continent at the same time. So here's an example of one of the more like broad things that was talked about. When Champlain fights the Mohawk, here's an image from the Library of Congress and a quote: "From the very beginning, native leaders and colonists found themselves enmeshed in alliances, entangled in feuds between imperial rivals or tribal enemies, whose implications they rarely understood." So, kind of taking one of the big themes from the book, the conflicts that were happening, but discussing how increasingly difficult it was to understand how culture, how accepted behaviors in war ended up impacting the relationships at the time. But then mixed in to those big, broad understandings were these narrow personal stories. For example, the story of Mary Rowlandson. So, Mary Rowlandson, for example, was captured during King Philip's War, and in a typical Algonquin custom, she would have been either put into slavery or adopted into a family. But she was actually sold to another tribe and then ended up being ransomed. And so that was not a typical behavior of American Indians until later. And she ended up being ransomed, returning to her family, and then she wrote her account. And she was the first American woman author published during her lifetime. And this picture is interesting because it's not historically accurate. She never actually admitted to fighting against the American Indians who were capturing her. But the story of Mary Rowlandson is quite popular in the region where it happened. So why I included kind of these two accounts was for you to understand or get a picture of how Weidensaul incorporates both very personal accounts as well as the big, broad historical narratives. So, important contributions is that this is an incredibly large undertaking to cohesively address this complex history. It took him about 6 years to really research and write this book. And as I mentioned earlier, he doesn't just rely on the accounts that are easiest to find, the historical record left behind by Europeans, but he sought to include the oral history left behind by American Indians as well. The detailed narratives, the personal accounts that he includes, really give uh, a really clear picture of the customs, beliefs, and behaviors of both American Indians and Europeans. But often the American Indians' customs were misunderstood and not given their proper attempts to understand. And it does also highlight more of the common events like King Philip's War, also Metacom's War, or the Seven Years' War, or French and Indian War. And while it does address those big things, it provides a significant amount of information regarding the forgotten history. Um, so this is a great book, not just on early American history, but also on cultural history, and it has some tastes or some moments of environmental history as well. So it's a dense book. I mean, there's a lot here. It's definitely for someone who loves history, but if this time period interests you, I do recommend taking a look. One final quote here. Frontier, the word carries the inevitable scent of the West, of sagebrush and vast prairie skies, of buffalo beyond number, and a peaceful sheet of smoke hanging low over skinned teepees. But before Custer, before the first Conestoga wagon creaked across the muddy paddle, before the first trappers pushed up the beaver streams of the Rockies, before Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery ascended the Missouri, there was another frontier, one that stretched from the Atlantic coast inland to the high, rugged ranges of the Appalachians and from the Maritimes to Florida. This was the first frontier. Check out the book. Let me know what you think.